Have you ever had the feeling that your real life hasn't started yet? That somehow you're meant for more than the life you're living right now? Maybe you're in your 20s or 30s. You tell yourself this version of your life is only temporary. You haven't made any decisive choices yet, and as long as you don't commit to one path, every possibility remains alive. And your future still feels wide open. You keep telling yourself you're just waiting for the right opportunity, the right relationship, or the right moment to become the person you're supposed to be. But while you're protecting that idealized version of your future, time is quietly moving without you. And one day you look up and realize that later on has already arrived. By refusing to choose, you've made a choice anyway. This life you're living, the routine, the dissatisfaction, the compromises, this is the life you have chosen by default. You are trapped by your own freedom. I have led a toothless life, he thought. A toothless life. I have never bitten into anything. I was waiting. I was reserving myself for later on. And I have just noticed that my teeth have gone. This is a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre's The Age of Reason. It's the first part of his trilogy, The Road to Freedom. And the man mourning his lost teeth is Mathieu. He is a philosophy teacher living in Paris during the summer of 1938 with the shadow of the Second World War hanging over Europe. But Mathieu isn't actually an old man, nor has he literally lost his teeth. He is only 34, and yet he spent so much of his life saving himself for the future that he's never really lived. Mathieu treasures his personal freedom above everything else, and to him, freedom means keeping every possibility alive. He avoids commitments and refuses to make any decision that might define the rest of his life. He prides himself on living without attachments or obligations, but everything changes when his longtime lover, Marcel, tells him she is pregnant. He doesn't want a child, and he doesn't want to marry Marcel because he fears it would trap him in the ordinary bourgeois life he has always rejected. But he also doesn't have the money to pay for an abortion, which is very dangerous and illegal in France at the time. So over the course of just 48 hours, he wanders through cafes, bars, and apartments across Paris, desperately trying to borrow enough money before his time runs out. And across these 2 days, he is forced to interact with friends, lovers, and family members. Each of them acts as a mirror, forcing him to question the very foundation of his life. For Mathieu, freedom is less about the freedom to choose than the freedom to never be defined by a choice. In his mind, the moment you choose one path, you give up all others. And to devote yourself to one person, one career, or one cause is to close the door on countless other lives you might have lived. So he keeps telling himself, not yet, not the right time to settle down, not the right time to have children, not the right time to commit. And as long as he avoids making a definitive choice, every possibility remains alive. He can still become anyone. But in Sartre's philosophy, so long as we exist in this world, it is impossible not to choose. Refusing to choose is a choice. Like every delay, every hesitation, and every refusal to commit is actively shaping who you become. And that is why when Mathieu runs to his older brother, Jacques, to ask for money for an abortion, Jacques tells him, "This coming child is the logical result of a situation into which you entered of your own free will, and you want to suppress it because you won't accept all the consequences of your acts." I think Mathieu is essentially looking for a safety net. He wants someone else to absorb the consequences of his choices so that it can return to the illusion of being completely free and unbound. But Jacques forces Mathieu to face reality by telling him that he has reached the age of reason. While traditionally, reaching the age of reason means becoming mature, stable, and capable of making responsible decisions, but Mathieu dismisses this idea because to him, it represents exactly the kind of life he despises, settling down, accepting social conventions, and retreating into that comfortable routines of the bourgeois world like Jacques. But Jacques points out that reaching the age of reason also means your childhood is over. You can no longer live as if someone else will always clean up after you. As an adult, you are the absolute author of your life. And Jacques tells him that freedom consisted in frankly confronting situations into which one had deliberately entered and accepting all one's responsibilities. So in a sense, the age of reason is the moment you realize you are completely alone, entirely responsible for the choices you make. You are free, but your absolute freedom is less of a prize than a crushing burden. And this brings us to one of Sartre's central philosophical ideas. We are condemned to be free. For Sartre, freedom is not a privilege or a luxury that we can choose to accept or reject. It is the unavoidable condition of human existence. And Sartre famously argues that existence precedes essence because unlike a manufactured object such as a paper knife, which is designed according to a particular concept or purpose before it is produced, a human being first exists, encounters the world, and only afterwards defines who they are through their actions. There's no pre-written blueprint, no divine fate, and no fixed human nature telling us how to live. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. We create ourselves through the choices we make, and we cannot escape this condition because as long as we exist, we are forced to choose. And because we are always choosing, we are always responsible for the person we become. And this is why Mathieu's attempt to remain undefined is ultimately impossible. He believes that by refusing to choose, he can escape responsibility and preserve every possibility. But Sartre would argue that even refusing to choose is a choice. The person who waits is still choosing to wait, and the person avoids commitment is still choosing avoidance. And over time, those choices become part of who they are. Mathieu wants freedom without responsibility, but Sartre's point is that the two can never be separated. To be free means to carry the weight of your own choices. And I think Mathieu's biggest delusion is one that many of us share. It is the belief that our true identity lies in our intentions, our dreams, and our unrealized potential. Because Mathieu sees himself as a noble, free-spirited philosopher who could do great things, who could live passionately, make some grand commitments, if only the circumstances were right. And in his mind, that inner potential is who he really is, while his ordinary, passive life is merely temporary. But Sartre tears down this illusion. In existentialism is a humanism, he says, man is nothing else but what he purposes. He exists only insofar as he realizes himself. He is therefore nothing else but the sum of his actions, nothing else but what his life is. For Sartre, there is no secret self hiding behind your behavior. You are not a great writer simply because you believe you could write a great book. You are not a courageous person because you imagine yourself doing something brave one day. And you cannot claim to be deeply committed to a cause if you never actually commit yourself to it. Mathieu has always looked down on Jacques' comfortable bourgeois life. He likes to think of himself as an independent intellectual, unbound by social conventions, but his actions tell a very different story because for 7 years, Mathieu has spent 4 nights a week with Marcel, slipping into her bedroom, sharing late-night conversations, and relying on her emotional support. He enjoys much of the intimacy and security of marriage without giving Marcel the social dignity of a wife. So Jacques argues that in every meaningful sense, Mathieu is living as a married man. He simply refuses to admit it. And moreover, Mathieu condemns the capitalist society, yet he works as a school teacher with a secure government salary and a state-guaranteed pension. He is a comfortable official in that society. He sympathizes with communists, but he won't join the party and has never voted. He wanted the moral thrill of being radical without any of the real-world risks or efforts. So it is his actions that make who he is, not the abstract ideas and intentions in his mind. Throughout the story, Mathieu keeps thinking he is washed out, and what's even worse, he realizes he has no excuse for his failure. Whatever happens, it is by my agency that everything must happen. Even if he let himself be carried off in helplessness and in despair, even if he let himself be carried off like an old sack of coal, he would have chosen his own damnation. He was free in every way, free to behave like a fool or a machine, free to accept, free to refuse, free to equivocate, to marry, to give up the game, to drag this dead weight about with him for years to come. He could do what he liked. No one had the right to advise him. There would be for him no good or evil unless he brought them into being. He was alone, enveloped in this monstrous silence, free and alone, without assistance and without excuse, condemned to decide without support from any quarter, condemned forever to be free. Well, people prefer to believe that cowards are born, not made, but Sartre insists that there is no such thing as a cowardly temperament or a heroic soul. Man is nothing else but the sum of his actions. We like to comfort ourselves by thinking, well, circumstances were against me, I had potential, but I never got the chance. But Sartre would argue, there is no genius apart from the works of art produced. No love apart from deeds of love, and no heroism apart from heroic acts. Mathieu cannot hide behind his unused potential or claim that he is secretly a brave man trapped in bad circumstances. He is simply the sum of his hesitations, his excuses, and his passivity. And this isn't just a story about Mathieu's personal life. It unfolds against the backdrop of Europe in the summer of 1938, and we know that 2 years earlier in 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out when General Franco launched a fascist military coup backed by Hitler and Mussolini to overthrow the Spanish Republic. And for young leftists, socialists, communists, and intellectuals across the continent, Spain has become the place where you could put your body on the line against fascism. And over 30,000 foreign volunteers from over 50 countries traveled to Spain to join the international brigades. Mathieu's friend Gomez is one of these volunteers. He is an artist, but he puts down his paintbrush and goes to Madrid to fight. Mathieu, however, only agonizes over Spain from a safe distance. Another friend, Brunet, is a dedicated member of the Communist Party who urges Mathieu to join the party as well. And he offers him a radical proposition. You renounced everything in order to be free, he said. Take one step further, renounce your own freedom, and everything shall be rendered unto you. Brunet understands something Mathieu refuses to accept. That is, freedom is not simply the preservation of an empty slate. It has to be exercised in the world. You have to choose to commit yourself, take a stand, and accept the consequences of that choice. Brunet knows that he might die in the coming war, but he feels no fear because he has deliberately chosen what his life is going to be about. He has committed to a cause he believes in and for which he is prepared to die. Mathieu envies him because having spent 34 years trying to avoid any kind of commitment, Mathieu clings to his abstract freedom, but instead of feeling liberated, he feels empty. He lives in a kind of void where nothing feels real. He feels that Brunet is freer than himself because his freedom is solid and concrete. And yet, when Brunet asks Mathieu to give up his own abstract freedom and commit himself to the communist movement, Mathieu hesitates and he says, I want to believe first. He insists that he must feel fully convinced before he can act. And his logic is like, I am not refusing to act out of cowardice. I am simply waiting because the right cause hasn't come along yet. And when the perfect opportunity arrives, I'll know it and then I'll throw myself into it. But I mean, what if there's no such thing as a perfect opportunity? Life doesn't hand us clean, beautifully packaged invitations to greatness, and real world situations are always compromised, messy, and full of uncertainty. Matthew spends his energy analyzing and weighing options in his head, but Sartre argues that action creates conviction, not the other way around. You cannot wait for absolute certainty. In Existentialism is Humanism, Sartre tells the story of a young man who is torn between staying in France to care for his mother and leaving to join the Free French forces during World War II. If he stays, he offers immediate concrete help to his mother, but perhaps he is abandoning the collective struggle against fascism. And if he leaves, he joins a noble cause, of course, but his contribution might end up being completely ineffective, or he might die before achieving anything at all. So, which choice is the right one? Sartre's answer is that there is no moral formula that can tell him what to do. Religion cannot give him a definitive answer. Abstract moral principles cannot tell him which responsibility is greater, and not even his own internal feelings can guide him because he can only measure the strength of a feeling after he has performed the action that defines it. So while Matthew keeps waiting for an inner epiphany to tell him how to live, Sartre insists that answers only exist through concrete action. At some point, you simply have to choose and invent your own path. So as Matthew continues to hesitate, Brunet warns him that time is running out. Tomorrow you will be too old. You will have acquired your little habits. You will be the slave of your own freedom. And perhaps, too, the world will be too old. So while Matthew is waiting for the right opportunity, time is fleeting. War is imminent, and the window for choice is closing. And if the war comes, Brunet says, suppose you go in your present state of mind, you'll burst like a bubble. You'll have dreamed away your 35 years of life, and then one fine day, a shell will blow your dreams to bits, and you will die without ever having woken up. So if Matthew dies in a war without having consciously committed to a cause, his death won't be a heroic sacrifice. It will be a meaningless accident. You can only define who you are through your choices and actions while you're alive. And once you die, your life becomes a closed book. People can only judge you by what you actually did. So if you spend your whole life dreaming of fighting for justice while staying safely on the sidelines, you are not a quiet revolutionary. You are just a passive bystander. And what is so interesting about this novel is that I think there is a bitter irony in the contrast between the enormous historical crisis unfolding around Matthew and the small personal crisis consuming him, because Europe is moving toward catastrophe. Fascism is advancing. Another world war is approaching. And Matthew is running around Paris trying to find 4,000 francs to pay for Marcel's abortion, just to avoid the burden of marriage and fatherhood. And I think he is also realizing that when the world is burning, what is the point of a freedom whose only purpose is guarding your own tiny backyard? There are men firing point blank at each other in the suburbs of Madrid. There are Austrian Jews agonizing in concentration camps. There are Chinese buried under the ruins of Nanking, and here I am, in perfect health. I feel quite free. In a quarter of an hour, I shall take my hat and go for a walk in the Luxembourg. Matthew hears the call of history, but like so many of us, he shields himself with a comfortable psychological defense. Let others do what I cannot do. He may think that he is just a philosopher and intellectual, and that direct action is meant for men like Gomez on the front lines or Brunet in the party. But this is precisely the attitude Sartre's existentialism is against, because Sartre argues that when we choose, we are not choosing only for ourselves. We are also implicitly saying, this is what I believe a human being can or should do. In choosing ourselves, we choose humanity. So Matthew cannot dismiss his choices as purely private when he refuses to go to Spain, when he refuses to commit to the Communist Party, when he refuses to acknowledge the commitments already embedded in his relationship with Marcel. He may tell himself that these are all private, victimless choices, but from Sartre's perspective, his choices still express a conception of what it means to be human. And there is another idea running through the novel that I find particularly interesting, and that is the fear of aging, because Matthew enjoys spending time with his young student, Boris, and his sister, Ivich. Boris and Ivich represent something Matthew desperately wants to hold on to, youth as possibility. But the irony is that Boris and Ivich are themselves terrified of aging. Boris genuinely believes that a man's vitality expires at 25, and after 30, life turns into a hollow afterlife. He romanticizes dying young to avoid the horrifying fate of becoming a settled, middle-aged intellectual. But in Sartre's existentialist thought, man is always in the process of creating himself through action. You are never a finished product. Man is the future of man. Even when you are old and gray, even when the twilight of life arrives, you retain an absolute agency. You can still choose, as Dylan Thomas wrote, not to go gentle into that good night. And I think the reason why The Age of Reason is still so relevant today is that even though our historical backdrop is very different, and most of us won't have to face a life or death choice like going to the front lines, the underlying dilemma remains the same. And in fact, we have far more freedom today. We are no longer bound to live where we grew up or conform to traditional timelines for marriage and family. We can redefine who we are, where we work, and how we live at virtually any age. We have instant access to global opportunities, remote work, and unlimited perspectives. The horizon of what is possible for a single human life has expanded exponentially. But having more options doesn't make choosing easier. And I mean, sometimes I think it makes it even harder. We live in an age of information overload. We can read books, research online, we can consult people from completely different walks of life, and we can even ask AI for help. And yet, at the end of all that, neither another person nor an algorithm can make the decision for us. We still have to choose what to do with our own lives. And, this is something I found myself thinking about while reading this novel, because I am someone who has often been quite passive in my own life. Like when faced with moments of indecision, my instinct is often to wait. I tell myself that I'll see what happens. I let circumstances unfold and allow life to make the decision for me. Like wherever life carries me, that's where I go. Even when I wasn't satisfied with where I landed, I just lacked the courage to actively step out. And why do I do that? And I think part of it is uncertainty. I am afraid of making the wrong choice. I tell myself that maybe this isn't the right time to change. Maybe I need more patience, or maybe something better will come along. And sometimes I comfort myself by thinking well, my current situation isn't that bad. And what if I make a change and things become even worse? And I think there is something very psychologically convenient about letting circumstances making the decision for you, because if you don't actively choose, then you don't have to take full responsibility for the outcome. I can tell myself this was fate. This is simply where life happened to take me. But Sartre reminds us that waiting isn't neutral. Doing nothing is also a way of deciding. Letting life carry you along is still a choice. And moreover, I think Matthew lived at a time when the great currents of history were impossible to ignore. History smashed directly into individual lives in the form of wars, revolutions, and ideological conflicts. And for Matthew, history forced the question, which side are you on? What are you willing to risk your life for? Our world is very different because, history is still moving all around us, but for many of us, it feels much more distant from the texture of everyday life. Like we can read about a war on our phones in the morning, go to work, have lunch with a friend, watch a movie in the evening, and carry on with our ordinary lives. We seem to live in an age of small concerns where our joys, sorrows, and anxieties are largely confined to our immediate surroundings. And yet, ironically, living in a small era makes finding meaning in life so much harder when there is no roaring historical currents sweeping us up into a grand cause. We're left entirely alone with ourselves, and we ask, if we cannot throw ourselves into the tides of history, how do we realize the value of our existence? And I think Sartre would argue creating meaning in a small era requires just as much courage as taking a stand in a grand era, because whenever you make a choice, you are never just choosing for yourself. You're also expressing an idea of how a human being should live. Like when you speak up against unfairness at work or school instead of staying silent to stay safe, you are casting a vote for justice itself. And when you choose to do your work with genuine care rather than succumbing to cynicism and quiet quitting, you're voting for personal integrity and craftsmanship. And when you choose to show up authentically for a friend or partner, letting down your guard instead of treating people as temporary or disposable, you're defining what real connection looks like in a lonely world. I mean, we don't really need a battlefield to live a life of moral weight. The meaning of life is created in these everyday choices. And that's all I wanted to say about Sartre's The Age of Reason. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.